because of his involvement in the demonstrations and speaking publicly against the regime that was there at that time. Robert Mugabe was arrested with other political leaders and was incarcerated for a period of 10 years. That is from 1964 to 1974. That's about 10 years. And during this time in prison, Robert Mugabe started to teach his some of the fellow inmates, and he was also studying. And during that time, he got about 3 to 4 degrees while he's in prison, and assisted others also to graduate with degrees while they're in prison. And this is part of the preoccupation that he had. And sadly, during his imprisonment, his child with Miss Mugabe passed on. The one who was called Namo Zenyika, he passed on, and Robert Mugabe asked leave to go and bury his child, but the then prison wardens denied him permission to go see or to bury his child. And that angered him so much that during his time in prison, he would interact with the wardeners, and these wardeners would then become the people conveying some of the messages that would come from outside. They would be sneaked or into prison and given to Robert Mugabe and the fellow inmates. He was in a number of prisons that are in Zimbabwe, such as Gonagodzingwa, Kami prisons, and so on. And it was not an easy time. During that time, the political leaders that had remained behind, people like Ndabaning Stole, who was then leading the organization in Zimbabwe. Or there is a part that I left where Robert Mugabe went to Zambia. And when he got to Zambia, I can't recall the year, he was taken into custody, he was assisted, or he stayed with the family of the current President Mnangagwa, in the same house. And which Robert Mugabe was older than Emerson Mnangagwa, the current president. And the parents of the current president took care of Emerson Mnangagwa, of Robert Mugabe, whilst they were in Zambia. And it was during these times, because of his eloquence, he was invited to speak even in Zambia, to talk to the then president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, Julius Nyerere, and so on. And I was at the point where I was saying there was the leader of ZANU, Ndabaning Stole, who remained outside leading the struggle. But because of the pressure that came out from the regime at that particular time, Ndabaning Stole conceded to some demands that did not go well with the ZANU leadership that was in prison. So he became a leader who was not the favorite. Because Robert Mugabe wanted to lead the struggle, he wanted an armed struggle, he then requested through others like Herbert Chitepo, Leopold Takawira, and so on, who were not in prison, to lead the organization. At one time, it is also Comrade Joshua Nkomo, because Comrade Joshua Nkomo thought that dialogue was important. We needed to sit down together with our enemies and craft an agreement that will lead to independence. And this is where they differed. Robert Mugabe wanted an all-out war to make sure that the whites would be brought into submission. So with those differences, there was a split, and the ZANU was formed, and Joshua Nkomo remained with NDP, which later transformed into ZAPU, to run two parallel political parties, one which was predominantly Ndebele, and the other one which was predominantly Shona. But I think you might also be interested in knowing that Robert Mugabe was from the Zezuru, and the Zezuru constitute a small proportion of the Shona people. But they together as the Shonas, although there were some scuffles because of the Shonas, the Karangas, the Korekores, and the Zezurus in the Shona grouping, they were able to coexist because all together they were known as Shonas. Then when Robert Mugabe, eventually, there is a point where Robert Mugabe, when he was in prison, was giving directions to how the war should be prosecuted. And when he came out of prison, he decided he had already been elected as the leader when people fell out of, when the Dabaning's story fell out of favor with the leadership that had gone to war. They elected Robert Mugabe to become the leader of the party. And Robert Mugabe, then when he was out of prison, he was then under house arrest, but they decided to go to the war front. And he went out with the assistance of Chief Rekai Tangwena and others. They went out together with Tekere to Mozambique. And when they got there, Robert Mugabe was placed in a house given by Samora Machel, but Samora Machel, it is said, did not trust Robert Mugabe. And they only trusted him after some time.
Okay. All right. No, please go. That is interesting.
So there was, because Robert Mugabe wanted war, and some of the leaders in our region preferred dialogue because Samora Machel had seen what had happened in Mozambique. And Robert Mugabe was speaking Marxism. And the Marxism, to many, is a philosophy, or was a philosophy, that if it was to be implemented, the enemies would be chased out of the country. And there were suspicions also on whether Robert Mugabe would be accepted and embraced by the leadership that was already at the war front. And luckily, Robert Mugabe was accepted by the leadership that was at the forefront, and he was then elected as the leader of ZANU in the first Congress that took place in Mozambique, where he was elected the substantive president and the leader of the ZANU-PF.
Right. Thank you so much for that. That's very important. In fact, I wanted also to understand what actually did Robert Mugabe wanted by being in politics. What was his mission, if we can say this was actually his mission in being in politics? Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, his mission was because he had been angered by a number of things that was happening in southern Rhodesia. The segregation which was in southern Rhodesia, the way how people had been confined, like the majority of the Africans had been confined to reserved areas where the land was could not yield the kind of results or yields as compared to what we saw in the areas where the whites had taken. It was only 6,000 whites who occupied most of the fertile land in Zimbabwe, and angered Robert Mugabe and many other nationalists. So one of the reasons was to make sure that there was a redress of the concerns and the concerns of the black majority, particularly to land distribution, as well as making sure that the segregation and discrimination that was obtaining in the country can be dealt with. We needed, people should be treated equally.
That is important. And it should be just for every just society.